Thing about us without us. I am framing my conversation as an activist of color who's worked in the city of Richmond for almost, 17 years. I was introduced to urban agriculture by African American farmers. For over a decade, we've worked in communities building farms and orchards, and I even did an indoor farm for Virginia State University and composting programs and all these different types of green spaces. And what I saw, what I've seen, is a predominance of white-led nonprofits operating in the urban agriculture space who articulate their work as increasing access for communities of color. However, what we have not seen is that those communities, while they live in a space as recipients of services, they often don't live in a space as recipients of funding. Food access is not food justice. We often talk about increasing proximity. So, we talk about let's start a grocery store in a community, or, someone will come in and start a farmer's market, or someone will come in and start a community garden even. But what we often don't see is a conversation with communities that are adversely impacted by these by the lack of healthy food access at the helm of the solutions in order to find ways to live and thrive in communities. So when I say food access isn't food justice, I try to articulate that so people can understand that food justice is digging into the root of the problem. We talk about slavery. We talk about Jim Crow discrimination. For those that eyes get glazed over when we bring up issues of slavery or Jim Crow, I'll say, hey, let's just go back 50 years. Let's talk about redlining in communities of color and how African American communities were not allowed to get financing for mortgages, and that those neighborhoods are now concentrated in poverty. And as a result of that concentration in poverty, now we don't see, the access or the grocery stores in those neighborhoods as a result. So when I say food justice is a conversation that we need to be having, I think it's important for us to discuss, why is it in a community of color we don't have an organization that's led by a community member of color that's getting the funding, but someone that is not from that community is coming in and getting the funding, right? Why is it that we can ask for some grocery store to come into our neighborhood, but we can't invest in the community members in that community in order to start their own grocery store, right? Why is it that when the grant comes out, there has to be an intermediary between that community and the low-income populations of that neighborhood? The bottom line is, who owns and controls the food system? Who's owning the production? Who owns the aggregation? Who owns the distribution? Who owns the waste management? And why aren't communities of color the first ones that have that ownership? So I work at Lewis Ginter, which is a very monochromatic organization. Yeah. The work I do at Lewis Ginter is centered around a conversation of equity. And what we've been challenged with, and what has been one of the most courageous experiences in my career, is walking with a predominantly white organization to have a conversation about race, to have a conversation about inclusion, to have a conversation about who's traditionally been excluded from the conversation. And what this has, broached is the topic of radical vulnerability. What does it take for, a 34-year-old predominantly white organization that has $7.5 million in this annual budget to walk with a community instead of doing for a community? Right? It's a paradigm shift. That paradigm shift is often scary, right? Because it requires folks to mess up. It requires mistakes to be made. It most importantly requires that organization to humble itself and say, hey, we don't have the answers, but we're in the practice of listening to communities of color, putting them in the cockpit and wrapping resources around them to realize urban agriculture or urban green spaces or maybe they just need access to some plant material or some wood or some soil. But whatever it is, we are not showing up until we're asked to show up, right? It's a challenge. And I often say it's amazing because I came from a radical left community background doing activism. And I had the same conversation that I had when I first started, advocating on behalf of communities of color at Lewis Ginter. But it's funny to watch people give me space to have a meeting when they would not open the door when I didn't work at, this monochromatic organization. It's a challenge because it requires everyone in the space to recognize how they are influenced by classism, how they're influenced by implicit bias, how they're influenced by straight up racism, I'll call it. You see an African American walk into the room, do you automatically think that that person is proficient, or do you think that you know better than them, right? And that's the real work. Like, how do we detox from these paternalistic ways of engaging with communities of color and say we're going to partner, and that our realities, the work that we really need to do, isn't about creating more access to healthy food. It's about balancing the scales for communities of color and white-led communities all across the country. This is not just something that's happening in Richmond, Virginia. I go from state to state and see the same phenomenon. White-led nonprofit gets all the money, black-led nonprofit gets none of it. And I think that is the real weight of the state. Thank you.